I don't like hunting and I don't like fishing. If there's one thing I remember about fishing when I was a kid, I went on it one time on a boat and I remember the guys telling me, don't throw your fishing rod too far back or it might hook the guy's eye and then you'll throw it and then they'll rip their eye out. And after that lesson, I never went fishing again. So do you like hunting and fishing? If you do, I'm going to make sure you don't anymore with this video I'm going to show you. So grab a blanket, turn off your lights for 3 true scary horror stories that happen while you're hunting or fishing. That time we had to use our code word. It was 2012, and my best friend Hannah had convinced me to join her on a weekend trip up north. She had, after searching for the longest time, found her dream car and was planning on traveling the 900 kilometers to the very north of Sweden to buy it. It was a second-hand two-door Suzuki Vitara in a purple-ish kind of color, and I must admit, I didn't share her obsession with it. But with her being the closest thing to a sister that I'll ever get, I was happy to join her nonetheless. Hannah and I had always had each other, from the cradle and onwards, sharing each other's love for adventure. We have traveled the world together. At the time this happened, we were both 21 years old and had recently returned from a trip in Asia. The man who was selling her the car had agreed to meet us at the small airport. When we arrived shortly before lunchtime, it had started to snow heavily. The first snow of the season, no less. The parking lot was almost empty. When I saw the man standing outside the Vitara, I felt immediately concerned. He was dressed nothing like a hunter. A lot of people in this area of the country live a lifestyle with hunting and fishing, so nothing strange with that really, but still, there was something about him that made me uneasy. He was nice though, smiling and waving to us, shaking hands with us both before walking us around the car and pointing out all the tiny little flaws. He showed us the work he had done on the car and showed the paperwork from the recently done engine repairs. He made the impression that he didn't want to hide anything. On the contrary, he made a show out of being very forthcoming and honest. The snow had now intensified, and we were getting cold. He opened the car door for us and said, "I got the paperwork at home. Let's close the deal over some coffee." Against all my instincts, I climbed in after Hannah, and both of us now trapped in the back seat. I had no reason to feel threatened by this man, who had been nothing but pleasant to us, other than the alarm bells going off inside my head. I can't tell what it was that made me feel that way, but there must have been some sign that something was wrong, something that my subconscious tuned into. The man was constantly talking. He showed the stereo, told us about the features of the car, about the places we drove past, about the wildlife and the nature. There was not a silent moment. After about 20 minutes, I started to notice that we were in no way moving in the direction of civilization. Instead, it seemed we were driving further and further into the vast wilderness. It struck me that he had us in the back of a 2-door car, driving us into unknown territory, and no one knew where we were. I looked at Hannah, who was happily listening to the man telling stories about the area, and I noticed she didn't look at all worried. Maybe I was totally overreacting. We drove past a group of people standing by the side of the road, hunters planning their day or taking a break maybe. This is a very different Sweden compared to the city. The car finally stopped outside a small wooden cottage with no neighboring houses, apart from a small cabin that we drove past a few hundred meters down the road, but it had looked empty. We followed the man inside. He was still talking nonstop and continued to do so until the moment the door closed behind us. Hannah kept asking things about the car, and I could sense that her voice had a new undertone now, a thin, sharp tenseness that made me wonder if she too had started to feel that something wasn't right. "I'll put the kettle on," he said. As he passed us to go into the kitchen, he let his hand touch Hannah's hair, and he smiled smugly. "May I use the bathroom?" I asked politely, and made my way to the door with the little red heart on. I was washing my hands when I saw something in the stained bathroom mirror. Something was hidden behind the water cistern. I pulled out a rolled up plastic folder, and as I turned the pages, I felt my blood run cold. It was very violent porn pictures that looked like they had been cut out from magazines, and they were glued to the paper, surrounded by cut-out pieces of handwritten text. Put together, it made a horrifying story about how a woman was lured into a car with a promise of getting to buy the car cheaply, and then it quickly turned into a horror story. I know this will sound silly, but when we traveled together, Hannah and I had a code word for whenever we felt like it was time to get out of a situation. We had never needed to use it, just joked about it, but now it came in handy. I walked out of the bathroom and looked at Hannah and said, "Potatoes. We forgot to buy potatoes. And that's too bad, because good God knows do we need some." The look on my face must have told her that the situation was no joke, and she said, "Oh, should we get some as soon as possible?" "The sooner the better," I replied. Hannah, always pretty and charming, and capable of great acting, casually walked over to the man in the kitchen, tapped his shoulder, and said, "Excuse me, but I was wondering if I can go have a quick look at the cam belt?" He huffed something about it being in good shape and handed over the keys. We got into the car and speeded off faster than the weather strictly speaking allowed. We left the car at the airport and hoped we hadn't made a terrible mistake. What if he reported it stolen? It would be embarrassing to explain to the police, but nothing happened. He didn't follow us, didn't report it in. We had to take the train since we had no plane tickets. The original plan had been to take the car home, and we didn't want to linger close to the airport in case he came looking for us. Later, Hannah asked what made me use the code word, and I told her about what I had found. It might just have been a fantasy, a sick game, and maybe he would never have done anything to us. But right then and there, I was convinced we would die if we didn't get out. Thank God Hannah didn't need any convincing or proof, just the code word. I truly think that if we hadn't talked about it so many times before, about how we would handle a situation where we needed to get out fast, things would have ended differently. Both of us knew that if either ever used the code word, it's time to get out. No questions asked, just move. Camping. A few years ago, I was camping with my sister-in-law and my two nieces, both between the ages of 5 to 8 at the time, for the weekend at a local campground that's on the lake and not far from our houses. We had picked a spot that was about 5 feet from the shore, and there weren't many people around us, since most people choose the electric lots to set up camp, and the area we were in was the primitive area. The spot we were at is the tip of a peninsula-like section of the area. There were many people passing by jet skis throughout the day and whatnot. You could anchor a fishing boat around where we were and fish, but you would just waste your time since the traffic from the other boats and jet skis were in and out so much, they would probably run over your line, so there weren't any fishermen out there. My two nieces were playing in the grass, while my SIL and me were putting up the tent, unpacking the van, etc. And I noticed a small fishing boat anchored out in the lake right across from our campsite, and the guy in it was staring at us. I, normally, wouldn't think anything of it, because it is a lake after all. But what made me pause was I didn't see any fishing poles sticking out of the boat. I never saw him cast out, and the guy in the boat was just sitting there. This wasn't a nice bass boat, a bass boat that you could kick back and relax in. It was just a green, all-metal boat that had benches to sit on instead of actual seats, and there was a faded rebel flag sticking up from the back. We get the tent up and everything set up, and we decide to just piddle around for a bit. I noticed the guy had left, and I didn't mention anything to my SIL about the guy in the boat, because he wasn't doing anything besides being kinda strange. But with my nieces being there, I just wanted to keep an eye out on him. After a while, we decided to go swimming. I was too concerned with making sure my nieces were okay in the water that I wasn't paying attention to anything around me. At one point, I had turned around and saw the boat out in the water in the same spot, and the guy staring at us again. I was starting to get really creeped out for the main fact that this guy left, came back, and was still sitting out in the middle of the water in his boat, just staring. At this point, I figured I better say something to my SIL. We got out of the water, got the kids dried off and dressed, and decided we should cook dinner, and the guy stayed out there the entire time. My nieces didn't want to stay the night, so my brother came by to take them home. When my brother pulled up, the guy took off, so that's how I saw that the flag was faded rebel flag. It gets dark, and we're sitting by the fire just talking and enjoying a quiet summer night out on the lake. It's about 10 p.m. at night, and I hear a boat approaching, which was weird because now the lake is dead. The only lights around us are the street lights from across the way, and the campfire, so when the boat passed by us, I see the lights shining through that faded flag. We both were like, oh shit, he's back, and we started to get a little nervous. About 10 to 15 minutes later, he came by again. Another 10 to 15 minutes later, he would pass by again. We knew it was him every single time because of that flag and the sound of his trolley motor. There was no denying it, it was the same guy. This back and forth lasted about 2 hours, and we were at our wits' end, since at any point he could tie up his boat on the other side of the peninsula, take a quick walk through the woods, and he's at our campsite. With the intervals being so consistently inconsistent, we had no idea what he was doing in between that 10 to 15 minute time frame, and we had no idea if he was even going to come back through again. Hell, the sound of the trolley motor gave us a few minutes of relief, since we knew that he was in the water and not on land coming for us. We are in a primitive area, which meant no electricity, so we did not have a cell phone. The campgrounds do have park rangers that drive by to check everything out, but he had already driven by before this back and forth started, so there was no telling when he would come back by. There wasn't anything we could do, so we just kept our ears open for any noises. Imagine doing that when the woods behind you are housed by deer, raccoons, squirrels, etc., and pointed our flashlight at the trees to make sure he wasn't coming through them. Finally, the park ranger came through, so we stopped him and explained what was happening. He said that he would make his trips more frequent to check on us if we need him before he comes back by then to drive to the ranger station. It's about a half-mile to a mile away from our site, but there wasn't anything he could do since the guy was on the lake and park rangers don't have boats. It sucked, but at least someone knew what was going on. An hour or so had passed since the last lakeside drive, so we were starting to think he was done for the evening and we were safe to go to bed. In mid-conversation, we heard the boat again, but this time, he stopped the boat out in the water, flashed a bright spotlight on us, and let this yeehaw type yell and then sped off. My SNL and I immediately jumped off on our chairs, got in the car, and drove to the ranger station. The ranger went to one of the other campers that had boats and asked them if they would mind driving him around the lake looking for this boat. They ended up recruiting 5 other boats to look for this guy. It took them about 30 to 45 minutes to find the guy and get the cops down there. The park ranger pulls up to our site and puts us in the car to drive us to where the cops have the guy, so we can identify him. The cops pull him out of the back seat, we stay in the park ranger's car, and the park ranger shines his spotlight on the guy so we can see him without him seeing us. The best way I can describe this dude is he looked like an anorexic Charles Manson. We tell the park ranger we can't identify him because he never came on land, but if they found him in that boat, then it's him. On the way back to the campsite, the park ranger told us the guy had passed out in the boat, drunk, naked, and had a hunting knife, and showed us the knife he had. The next morning, we packed up and went home. The Whistler. Big fan of the subreddit for lurkery. This happened to me a few years ago, and I don't often talk about it, since it's weird and gory, and not the kind of story you whip out at cocktail parties. But here it goes. A couple years ago, I was stressed out from college and big city life in general, and decided to spend a long weekend in the woods, doing what my city friends consider utter lunacy, and us outdoorsy people consider nirvana. Deep woods free camping in the winter, alone. While this sounds like the beginning of a missing persons report, if you are an experienced outdoorsman, it's pretty safe. I also take a secret pleasure in being the white trash warriorness my dad always hoped I'd be. I always hated the fact of claustrophobia that came with being female in the city, avoiding eye contact, not walking alone at night. When you're a girl alone out in the woods, you're in charge. You're safe within the warm embrace of your own solitary freedom, or so I thought. I spent a few hours on the road, the surrounding getting wilder and wilder as I drove. I parked in an allowed roadside ditch, and with a compass and a map, hiked until I was in a mile's reach or so of some good ice fishing. I was at least 4 miles from the road. I made an extremely discreet camp in a clearing, with just one little hole in the snow for my tiny tent and my tiny campfire. After a couple beautiful days of just hiking and relaxing around camp, I made the trek to the fishing hole. Everything was in utter winter stillness. The air was crisp, and the only signs that I wasn't in a perfect vacuum were the twitterings of birds and the very distant rumblings of the half-frozen waterfalls. After a mile or so of crunching along in the snow, I silently celebrated my compass skills when I came out at the exact place I had intended to. I punched a hole in the thin crust of ice and set to getting my fish on. My first catch came quickly. After a few weeks under a frozen surface, fishes be hungry and shit, I was feeling oddly fatigued and jumpy, so I decided to just clean the fish here and now and take it straight back to my camp to cook. Yummy. I quickly realized my fish preparation skills were rusty at best. I cursed my lack of preparation as I cut myself for the second time. Something in my peripheral senses was irritating me, but I was very set in my task, focusing on the motions in the slippery mess. The thing in periphery was growing more irritating, like the buzzing of a fly or the yammering of a sibling. I carved and hacked and sliced my hand open freshly as the fish slipped out of my hands and into the snow. Frustrated, I shouted, "Fuck off with that whistling, will you?" Silence resumed, and then my heart stopped. Living in a college neighborhood, I had grown so accustomed to white noise that I had failed to recognize how grossly inappropriate this sound was in this context. The silence weighed down on me as I broke into a sweat. The only reason a human would be this deep in the woods would be to hunt, and no hunter would give himself away like that. And if he was whistling for any other reason, shouldn't he have reacted to my outburst? Yelled something vulgar back? Apologized? No, nothing. Just the total stillness of the woods. Silence, as pure as it was before I spoke. Unsure if I had misheard the twitterings of a bird or something, I just decided the fish was a lost cause, slung my gear over my shoulder, and headed for camp. I trudged off in the woods, and about a quarter mile from camp, I saw a large mass protruding from the snow. Apprehensive but drawn like a moth to the flame, I trudged up to what materialized in the closing distance as a moose kill. A really, really good moose kill. A clean shot through the upturned eye, staring at me and saying something that was imposing a sense of dread on me, but a dread I couldn't translate. I ran hard and I ran fast in the snow and the woods. Everything looked the same. I knew I was moving south, and I knew I'd pass camp on the east. I made for the road, eventually slowing down to a wary trudge, calming at the comforting sight of the woods clearing ahead to make way for the country roadway. I looked to my left and saw my car 50 yards or so down. I jogged to it and drove the lonely 15 miles to the first motel I saw signs for. I had none of my belongings and no earthly idea why I had just abandoned ship like that. It was only as I was sitting up watching infomercials that night that it started to fall together. Why would the Park Service issue free camp passes for the same stretch of woods that they allowed hunting? The moose defied everything of my rudimentary understanding of hunting. Even with the snow to cool it, decomp starts quickly on an animal that size. You'd have time for a few quick pictures, but you want to have it dressed quickly. Why would you kill a moose 5 miles into the forest? How could you ever drag it back to the road? In the morning, in a sleep-deprived and paranoid state, I described everything I'd seen and thought I heard to a very confused park ranger. He seemed more vexed about illegal hunting than any of my crazy city girl ramblings. He said he wanted to come pick me up and have me take him to where I thought the kill site was. I said I was only going if he brought a gun. He sighed with exasperation and told me when to meet him. We rode out into the woods on an ATV, with me awkwardly riding on the back, as if on the back of the world's awkwardest motorcycle. We got to a large impression in the snow where the moose had been. Blood was everywhere. There was also the distant track of the carcass being dragged. The drag marks made a smooth trail in the snow, as if the carcass were on a tarp. The ranger said he should take me back now. He asked where my camp was. I pointed in the direction of the drag marks. It looked like he was finally sharing in my unease. Back at the hotel, I washed my clothes in the sink and prepared to drive home in the morning. An unknown number called my phone. It was the park ranger. The moose had been dragged to my campsite. He described the scene as a huge mess. He wasn't sure if an animal had helped me to make the mess, but one thing was clear. Someone had cut into my tent with a knife. I asked about the rest of my belongings. He said darkly, "You don't want them back. They're covered in moose mess." So, what happens now? Well, miss, we're just gonna keep an eye out for this guy. I haven't heard or seen anything like this ever before. I'm really sorry this happened. And that was it. No closure, no explanation. In the years that have passed, I tried to every different application of reason. A hunter who needed help, but knew I was already gone. A deranged psychopath looking to make his second kill. One of the few friends I shared the story with envisioned him as some deep woods Sweeney Todd. He dubbed him Moosey Todd. I still don't know why I didn't hear the gunshot. The whistling seemed so vivid in my memory, but was it even real? One question has been definitely answered. I'll never go into the woods alone again. Geez, sorry this is long, thanks for reading. I feel a lot better having shared, and sorry for the bad grammar and typos. I'm on my phone.